believe in the idea of amnesty for those who have put down roots and who have lived here, even though some time back they may have entered illegally.
We're getting much more serious about cracking down on gun running, drug running, cash that's flowing down that's helping to finance these cartels.
And so the bill that we've worked hard to craft is an important piece of legislation that addresses the needs of a failed system, that says we're going to change for the better.
The overwhelming majority of people coming to the border and crossing are being sent back.
Our elected officials are lying to us. We are living in a world of disinformation, one where major news stories are suppressed and the narratives surrounding mainstream media outlets are curated by big government, big media, and big tech. Welcome to Dark Wars, The Border. I'm Sara Carter. I've spent the majority of my career covering immigration and border issues for newspapers, television, and radio. But there's a crisis happening at our southern border, and I know many of the people this impacts most.
I've never, ever seen this in my life. I'm stunned.
The people I was traveling with were good people. The problem was the coyotes.
They are people with money that want to buy the organs of kids.
107,000 overdose deaths last year alone.
Marin died 2 weeks after her 20th birthday.
So they'll just come here and get their shit. It's just open air.
In this series, we'll show you the border like you've never seen it before. And spoiler alert, the border sometimes is nowhere near the border.
Fucking open air.
Because every state is a border state.
Look at that there. She's just passed out with the needle right there.
Every town is a border town.
Just open air.
And yes, that includes yours.
Right in her neck.
Derek Maltz is a former special agent in charge at the Drug Enforcement Administration who served more than 30 years. He couldn't believe what he and another retired law enforcement officer saw recently during a drive through Philadelphia.
Right here in Kensington, you see them just sitting around, shooting up needles right on the street.
Open air. Passed out with needles in their arms. Passed out. Nobody's doing nothing about it.
Where's the mayor of Philadelphia?
Kensington Ave. This is the heart of Kensington. But that little scene over there is almost every quarter in this mile radius, east, west, north, and south. Almost every corner looks like that.
And he says open drug use in major American cities is worse now than it's ever been.
I've never, ever seen this in my life. I'm stunned. My life has been changed from this trip this week into Philadelphia, and the mayor should be ashamed. Mayor Kenny, who's celebrating, with his assistant last year or whenever it was when they passed sanctuary city laws. But what about these poor people? We're sending billions of dollars to Ukraine and other parts of the world, which I understand. But what about these people that are desperately needing help on the streets all over the country?
It isn't just Derek Maltz and his friend that are seeing what's happening on our streets. It's every single parent. Every child that has to walk from point A to point B, hoping that they won't get killed, hoping that somebody won't cross their path. And every parent that loses a child to the war on drugs, or every immigrant living in the shadows that is being kept as a slave. This is what we're up against. We're up against this because nobody else is helping us fight that war from Washington. You might have heard that there's a war at the border, but it's also a war where the weapon is deception and lies. It's information warfare, and the only way to fight back is to expose the truth. Who can we trust to give us that truth? Not the majority of people claiming to be looking after our interests in Washington. No matter what you've heard about the border from the media or many of our elected officials, you are being deceived.
Do you know who the greatest propagator of disinformation in the history of the world is? The U.S. government. Are you familiar with McNamara, the Pentagon Papers? Are you familiar with George W. Bush and the weapons of mass destruction? Are you familiar with Iran-Contra?
Kentucky Senator Rand Paul.
I mean, think of all the debates and disputes we've had over the last 50 years in our country. We work them out by debating them. We don't work them out by the government being the arbiter. I don't want you guardrails. I want you to have nothing to do with speech. You think we can't determine, speech by traffickers is disinformation? You think the American people are so stupid they need you to tell them what the truth is? You can't even admit what the truth is with the Steele dossier. I don't trust government to figure out what the truth is. Government is largely disseminating disinformation.
The battle against disinformation is happening on many fronts. The border crisis is one of the most critical. We're told migrants are on a journey of hope and opportunity. But the reality that awaits many of them is filled with pain, death, and heartache.
I am very thankful to God because nothing happened to me. But I do have a friend who the federal police got her and wanted her to work forced labor, prostitution.
This is just one of hundreds, maybe thousands of stories that we never hear, of children being taken, of women being raped, of people disappearing on their journey into the United States and being traumatized even when they come here. The suffering's real, and the truth is sometimes really hard to listen to. And some of those who could do the most to confront the problem are only making it worse. Facebook, TikTok, WhatsApp, and other popular social media platforms are doing little to slow the spread of misinformation and disinformation. They're actually making these problems worse by allowing groups to make posts promising migrants high-wage jobs, an easy voyage, and a significantly better life once they reach the United States. In many cases, these folks end up brutalized.
We've spent these days in the rivers, in the jungles, in the mountains, always looking behind us.
Yo me imagino que también con los criminales y la gente que te quieren robar.
Yes, of course. Not only that, but the women being raped, the little girls being raped.
Open borders impact the health and safety of our communities and damage our national security. According to the Kaiser Family Foundation, 22 million illegal immigrants are currently in the United States. The problem is getting harder to deal with every year, and especially in recent years, with people from all over the world pouring across the open southern border. They're overwhelming our national and local law enforcement agencies, healthcare system, and even social services. And even those who strongly supported sanctuary cities, like New York City Mayor Eric Adams, see the crisis this is causing.
This is a real burden on New Yorkers as we're trying to do the right thing. We already, as I stated, we already have an overburdened shelter system. So now we're talking about, as you stated, food, clothing, school. This is going to impact our schools because we do not turn away individuals because they're undocumented. Translation services. There's just a whole host of things that this is going to produce, and that's why we need help in getting this done, and we need the right coordination to make it happen.
But the problem is not just the tide of humanity coming across our border and overwhelming our system. It's about our enemies taking advantage of this chaos to find ways to harm our country, our communities, and our families. Brian Babin is a congressman from Texas, and he's a member of the House Border Caucus.
107,000 overdose deaths last year alone. The DEA has already seized 20-point-something million fake prescription pills. These are pills that have, who knows what's in them. Many of them have the fentanyl in them, and they're designed to look exactly like legitimate prescriptions.
The flow of illegal drugs into the U.S. from the southern border isn't new. It started as bootlegging during Prohibition. People were making money running booze into America over the desert. That developed into marijuana, and then the war on drugs began. Harder drugs started pouring in over the border, from heroin and pills to crystal meth. Now drug traffickers are moving fentanyl-laced counterfeit pills. They are murdering our children in schools and in communities from Florida to Washington State. Former DEA Special Agent Derek Maltz.
What they're doing now is something that we've never seen in the history of the country. They're taking poisonous drugs like fentanyl and they're putting them in pills. They have pill presses inside of Mexico and in our country, and they're making these counterfeit oxycodone pills, Xanax, and now even Adderall. We had a warning by the DEA last week up in New England. They had all these pills that were labeled as Adderall that contained methamphetamine. Well, that's really disturbing because the kids that are taking Adderall are very, very young. To me, this is the cartel's conscious decision to target the kids so they have customers for life with methamphetamine. But really what's disturbing is that kids all over the country and young Americans are taking these counterfeit pills and not waking up. There's story after story that you see on social media, and unfortunately you're not seeing that on mainstream media.
Maltz is right. I've seen it. I've talked to parents who've lost their children. I can't even imagine the pain that they go through every single day. The loss of a child that never expected to die, or someone in their life that never expected to die from just taking a pill. The cartels are battling each other for access to transit routes at our border. Border access is the biggest prize for drug and human traffickers. Think about it. Why is it important? Because they feed the bloodline of America. They access our highway system, and that means traffickers can move their products over the border more easily and efficiently. Once they gain access to these major transportation hubs like Houston, Tucson, Phoenix, San Antonio, or San Diego, they are home free. And they can deliver their poison, whether it's drugs, human slaves, or weapons, straight into the heart of America. It weakens our national security and our communities across the nation. I met with Sheriff Tom Schmerber of Maverick County, Texas, in the border community of Eagle Pass. It's a town just like every other border town. People are pouring across from all over the world into their community. And this isn't just people from Mexico. It's people from everywhere. Sometimes you look across the border and there's more than 500 coming through into a pecan farm or someone's ranch land. The sheriff is frustrated with the lack of support he's getting from the federal government.
We need the resources. We need more manpower. I know that we have a whole bunch of border relations, but I don't blame them. The border relations are very busy right now. They catch a big group, they have to process, and they have to do a lot of work, So it means that if they need the help, they need the resources, I need a whole much more manpower, the manpower and the equipment. So if they can help us with that, with the resources, it'd be great. We can maybe control the border better.
The record amounts of drugs crossing that border go to cartel-owned distribution centers throughout our country and ultimately lead to the enormous numbers of overdose and drug poisoning deaths that we're experiencing across the nation. Many of the victims of our drug epidemic struggle with insecurities that many of us deal with every day. I first met Heidi Riggs more than 4 years ago while I was working on another documentary entitled Not in Vain. Heidi's only daughter, Marin, died 2 weeks after her 20th birthday.
The first time she used heroin, she smoked it. She said it was like seeing the face of God. Marin had a very caring heart, But she also struggled within herself, self-esteem, wanting to fit in. She never thought she was beautiful enough. And so she struggled with her weight. She was athletic and she was built like an athlete. But she always wanted that skinny girl body. She was bullied and she really struggled with that.
The drugs are creating death and heartache throughout our nation, and the pain and suffering faced by the vulnerable migrants making the journey are just as horrifying. Why are people coming? Economics. We hear from politicians that it's about access to health care or people in desperate need of asylum because they are fleeing political violence. But the truth is evident when you talk to the people from Latin America who really know what is going on. Guatemala is an extraordinary country. From its lush triple canopy jungles to its vast and fertile farmland, where they grow bananas, avocados, coffee, and cocoa beans. It's also a country rich in history. Its ancient Aztec artifacts, the Mayan ruins. On a recent visit to Guatemala, I met with President Alejandro Giammattei at his presidential palace. It's right in the heart of Guatemala City. President Giammattei isn't one to remain silent about the crisis at the U.S. Mexico border and how it directly affects his nation's people. He told me on my recent visit that there are solutions to resolving this crisis.
Lo tienen que hacer. Y le voy a poner un ejemplo.
Guatemala is perfectly positioned to be the perfect nearshoring. Transportation and shipping costs have gone up incredibly. From here to the United States, it is cheaper. If the train is put into operation, we could have a container in Chicago in 3 days. It would be cheaper than having maritime transportation. If we have U.S. companies here, for example, yarn or parts assembly companies, we could generate thousands of jobs in Guatemala. These people would not leave. But it would be considerably cheaper for the United States itself, which would cause their own products to be cheaper because they would not have any additional costs. One, we have a free trade agreement with the United States. We have a free trade agreement with Mexico, which means that either through NAFTA or CAFTA, we could bring those products into the United States, and it would be cheaper for Americans.
Countries in Central America are concerned about the massive drain in human capital. Guatemala and other Latin American nations want a good relationship with the United States. But according to officials in Guatemala, our State Department plays political favorites, becoming intimately involved in their politics. Leaders like Giammattei are trying to keep up with their country's problems. But he says the deep state within the State Department is contributing to their failure to advance economically, to the vast migration to the U.S. border.
¿Por qué la insistencia?
Why do they insist? Not the Department of State, but the Deep State Department. They want to label us as a country that violates human rights, when we are fighting to overcome the causes that originate from social exclusion, marginalization, and poverty. There's no other way to do it than through economic growth.
What does the deep state of the State Department and those working, I'm assuming on the left side, in your opinion, want from Guatemala? What do they want you to do in an effort?
It's easy to answer. They don't like me. They would like to have something like Colombia or even Venezuela here.
Our State Department knows the problems in Latin America and exacerbates them. It is easy to blame corruption and drug dealing on Central and South American countries, but we take advantage of their systems to benefit us in the short term. It is a short-sighted policy that hurts Americans and the people who dare to make the long and dangerous journey to our southern border. I met this woman in Guatemala City who had made her way to the United States being trafficked by coyotes. Those are the people that move the people on the ground for the drug cartels. She passed through multiple nations, And when she reached the United States, her situation even became worse, more dire. And eventually, she repatriated herself back to Guatemala.
The people I was traveling with were good people. The problem was the coyotes. What happened was the coyotes threatened to abandon me. They told me I had to pay more money, and then they called and sent messages. And the people I was with had to come up with the money. That was just to get to Reynosa.
This woman left her 2-year-old in Guatemala. Many parents that make it to the U.S. illegally then send for their children years later. Those children are trafficked by strangers, sent on a dangerous journey to reach the U.S. Mexico border. Meanwhile, Americans who leave their kids in their car for just a few minutes while popping into a store are treated differently. Chris Cabrera is vice president of the National Border Patrol Council.
If you left your kid in the car for 5 minutes while you ran in to get some milk at Walmart, you're getting locked up. You're abandoning that kid, or you're endangering that kid. But yet we see people, grown women with a newborn, literally days old, on a 4-person raft with 27 people on there, and they're crossing the river, and that's endangering that child. Or you see a 7-year-old girl, which I see time and time again, a 7-year-old girl that is traveling by herself in a group full of older boys and men, and maybe 1 or 2 women in there. And luckily, somebody always grabs, guards that child and kind of takes them under their wing. But I can imagine that doesn't always happen.
How bad is it? Here we are in the 2020s, and slavery is a serious problem in the United States. It runs bigger and runs much deeper than a lot of us think. Sex abuse and rape are common during migration. Of more than 40 million slaves worldwide in 2016, 403,000 of those people were modern-day slaves in the United States. And with the border crisis we're seeing today, I can promise you that number isn't getting smaller. For many kids, the journey is not just a one-time horror. Many unaccompanied children are used by cartels and traffickers over and over again to facilitate their criminal activities. Tennessee Senator Marsha Blackburn explains how this horrific process works and how U.S. Border Patrol officials expect the worst.
They show up, they get abandoned after the person gets across the border, then they get turned around and sent back to their family. Sometimes the person in charge of them is with the cartel. They get assigned to another family. They come back over. It is the cartel's child recycling program. It is atrocious. Young girls as young as 10, 11, 12 who come into our custody have to be given pregnancy tests because of the violation that is taking place against women and girls. It is a crisis, a national security crisis, a humanitarian crisis, an environmental crisis.
The total number of people abused along the way and who remain in slavery after they get to the U.S. is horrific enough. But remember that each of these victims is a person who deserves dignity and respect and is violated in unspeakable ways. There are people I meet along the border, sometimes as young as 15, 13, sometimes in their 20s. Many of the women that I speak with, many of them have been violated. That's how they say it. They say violada. Or they just sit there and cry because they don't even know who to trust anymore. They spend their time protecting themselves or disengaging their mind from the physical abuse that is happening to their bodies. You can't even imagine, they say, for many of them, what we've been through.
I was very afraid. I felt my life was not in my hands anymore. It was in theirs. I was very scared. I'm very thankful to God because nothing happened to me. But I do have a friend who the federal police got her and wanted her to work forced labor. prostitution. I'm also scared about those children who are crossing alone. I don't recommend it to anyone, and it's a really harsh journey, especially for children.
What did they want her to do? ¿Qué querían que ella hiciera? Prostituirse.
The sad fact is thousands of women and girls have similar stories. U.S. lawmakers like Florida Congressman Greg Murphy argue that this is unconscionable abuse and should not and cannot continue.
We've known now that a third of the women who are coming across the border have been sexually abused.
Correct.
Okay, a third. And you think about the vulnerability of those girls who are coming in that have no parental guidance, they have no parental protection, and thrusting them into the country. Just think the number that will be sold into literal sex slavery.
Right.
I mean, we're living, as we said before, in a bizarre world.
Rape doesn't end at the border. Unfortunately for many young women and girls, that abuse is just the beginning. Rosy Orozco is an activist from Mexico who is fighting against human trafficking, slavery, and even more terrible outcomes.
40% of these ladies will die in a very violent way. 40%, Sara. That's the numbers. And it's terrible. So many of them are killed in the worst nightmare that you can imagine.
For the migrants lucky enough to escape being sold into sex slavery, a different fate awaits, and almost none of the options are good. Wisconsin Congressman Tom Tiffany has made it his personal mission to expose what is happening at the border. He traveled to the Panamanian jungle into the most dangerous area of the Darien Gap to bring the truth to the American people, and one that he says affects his community personally.
They continue to get pushed up the pipeline until they get to the United States. And every step of the way, they pay, and they pay the smugglers and others. And in the meantime, some of them die. Mm-hmm. All of them are paying a ransom to get into America. And we're hearing that many people end up as indentured servants when they get here to America, where they got to send money back to the smugglers, the cartels, the coyotes, and all the rest.
Traffickers often lure migrants and people from poor rural areas in Mexico and Latin America with offers of better paying jobs, only to reach the U.S. and work for little pay. Threats of deportation or even violence against their families are held over their heads. And if they can't pay their debts, they'll often end up dead. I want you to listen to this man. He's a human trafficker. We'll call him Mario. I met him in Guatemala City at an undisclosed location. I was terrified of what might happen if we were discovered there with him. He was at first quiet and reserved, and then he explained why he wanted to talk to me.
They are people with money that want to buy the organs of kids. And it's not only for a country. They take it to different countries. And normally, they do this with clinics that are not authorized.
That's why so many people who have traveled a long way are discouraging others from bringing their children or sending for their children or making the same terrible mistake in deciding to leave.
If I could bring them another way, God willing, I would. But from what I've been through, I wouldn't recommend this for anyone. We've spent these days in the rivers, in the jungles, in the mountains, always looking behind us. Yes, of course. Not only that, but the women being raped, the little girls being raped. But it is something I had to do for the benefit of my family.
Organized crime syndicates are trafficking human beings and drugs into our country, and that exposes our nation to a litany of other threats. These organizations are only loyal to the bottom dollar, no loyalty to their country or ours. Imagine what can happen when you give them this access. The border is so much different now. Even from when I was young. I mean, I remember you know, being 18, 19, 20 years old in California, and it was still dangerous back then. The Arellano Felix cartel was in control of Tijuana. But I would go across the border with my brother, with our family, and with our friends, maybe down to Rosarita Beach.
In those days, there was no immigration like that. You can go to Mexico, stay over there, come back. There was no such thing as immigration papers, things like that. You know, some families, like my wife's grandmother, she grew up in Carrizo, but then her mother decided to go back to Mexico instead of staying here, and they went to Mexico. You know, and some people vice versa, because there was no such thing as
the border,
anything like that. You know.
We'd spend time there shopping, enjoying the weather, enjoying the beach, enjoying the community.
Then all of a sudden, when I came here in Eagle Pass as a border relation, I saw people that were from the city, from the towns, walking. Wow, I mean, and they were starting to, some would die, you know, some would not make it and so forth. But not as much as right now, you know what I mean?
But slowly, it started shifting. The cartel's undercurrent wasn't hidden anymore. Police were beheaded, their heads put on stakes along the highway in Rosarita. Gang violence took over the streets, shootings, robberies. People were afraid. They didn't want to go anymore. We didn't want to take those trips into Mexico. And it was a very difficult time, and has been a very difficult time for people in all the border communities, from California all the way to Texas. The situation at the U.S. Mexico border is making it more dangerous for all of us. Different groups of drug and human traffickers are engaging in vicious power struggles over money. These massive, nefarious organizations are fueling bribery, blackmail, and corruption on both sides of the border, and they are destroying the trust between the United States and Mexico. This puts all of us in danger because the countries need to work together to solve the many complex and evolving national security issues that are happening along the 2,000-mile-long border, from terrorism to trafficking to disease.
If we catch 3,000 people a day crossing the border, we're barely able to vet them. That's just way too many.
Arizona Congressman Andy Biggs is a member of the House Border Caucus.
But we know that we at least 1-to-1, some estimates as high as 3 and 4 and 5-to-1 are getaways. And if that's the case, you have anywhere from 3,000 to 10,000 people a day practically coming across the border. We have no idea who they are.
The COVID-19 pandemic highlights some of the health risks posed by people crossing the border unchecked. But what about the next pandemic? Polio from unvaccinated migrants, drug-resistant tuberculosis, and monkeypox have all been documented, and unhealthy holding facilities make these problems worse. Congressman Biggs says they also put American lives at risk.
They can have any kind of disease. I was at Antelope Wells, a year and a half ago, and I was talking, right during the surge, I was talking to an official there, and I said, what diseases have you seen? He starts going through everything from leprosy to smallpox, and then he says, and then there was a disease where a guy's arm is literally being eaten away by something, bacteria or something, and nobody could ever identify what the disease was. And we're sitting here, they're not doing a rapid test on COVID either down there, Sarah. And the Biden plan is to just catch and release these people back into the United States.
People are being released without a full medical checkup. How much sense does that make? America's policies are exacerbating national security issues. Meanwhile, politicians like Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas are telling us everything is under control.
We have effectively managed an unprecedented number of non-citizens seeking to enter the United States.
Then there are the people who come into the U.S. who evade our border patrol. There are roughly 900,000 gotaways since President Biden took office. And these are only the people that we know that got away. We have no idea exactly how many there really are or even who they are. Some even have links to terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and Hamas. And that has Congressman Tiffany worried that we're opening ourselves up to another terrorist attack.
The thing that is of the greatest concern to me is the national security implications.
Absolutely.
Because when you see people coming here from Somalia, you're coming from Iran, they're coming from places around the world, people coming from China. And this is a real concern for us, where it's easy to melt into the tens of thousands of people that are steadily coming up day after day and be able to come into our country as a free pass. And all people have to do is look back to 2015 with the mass migration that happened from the Middle East into Europe, and all the terrorist bombings and things like that happened after that. We're setting ourselves up to do the same thing in America.
The government can't even answer what happened to the more than 80 people from the terrorist watch list after they were apprehended at our border. As we learned with 9/11 and other terrorist attacks, it doesn't take very many people with evil intentions to change our country forever. Senator Marsha Blackburn understands how vital it is to stop the flow of people crossing our southern border illegally and the damage it can do throughout the U.S.
At the southern border this year, our Border Patrol has apprehended people that are on the terrorist watch list. They have apprehended known gang members that are coming into this country for probably no good. They are our adversaries. They are not here to get a job. They are here to sell drugs, to traffic people, to create chaos in local communities. And this is why every town's a border town and every state is a border state.
In Blackburn's home state of Tennessee, the federal government was exposed for trying to sneak in migrants, including unaccompanied minors. These people were arriving in the middle of the night on planes and buses to communities that had no idea they were coming. Local officials had no time to come up with a plan on how to care for or support the migrants. This cavalier approach to open borders is hurting our nation and weakens the Latin American nations the migrants are coming from. If we want better border security, we should be working together with our Central American allies, not against them. It's a message that Guatemalan President Alejandro Giammattei is begging the U.S. government to hear. But that message is falling on deaf ears.
Did you ever express all of these concerns to the Biden administration? I know you didn't attend the summit.
A few times.
A few times. What was their response to you?
I'm waiting.
So you have not received any significant response from the Biden administration with regard to the border policies?
Well,
or the border czar, Kamala Harris?
It's difficult to lie. And the answer, I cannot lie.
Is no.
I cannot lie.
For decades, the U.S. government has had a failed Latin American policy. We treat these nations and people like they are the help, like third world nations. We have failed badly with our diplomacy in the Western Hemisphere, and as a result, we are endangering our own national security. Most Americans have no idea what we're up against. Drugs, America's overdose epidemic, human trafficking, slavery, and threats to national security. What brings all those things to America every day? The cartels. In the 1980s, the cartels amassed enough money and power to take on the U.S. government.
All right, Ann, thank you. Meanwhile, the search for the killers of U.S. Drug Enforcement agent Enrique Camarena Salazar is in high gear tonight.
It started with the 1985 kidnapping, torture, and execution of undercover DEA agent Enrique Kiki Camarena. After that, U.S. agents on both sides of the border, but especially in Mexico, knew that they were being watched, tracked, and in some cases hunted. That's what happened to retired Immigration and Customs Enforcement Special Supervisory Agent Victor Avila, as he and his partner, Jaime Zapata, were ambushed by cartel gunmen.
Back on 2011, Special Agent Jaime Zapata and I were attacked on Highway 57, which is a main corridor between Mexico City that we would travel this road to go up to Texas. On the way back from an assignment, we were ambushed by Los Zetas cartel and shot at over 100 rounds. And Special Agent Jaime Zapata tragically lost his life in the line of duty. Next to me, I was shot 3 times, and once in my chest, twice in my left leg. And I am here by the grace of God to be able to share the story.
Avila was critically wounded during the attack and left before the ambulance could reach him because he was terrified that rescue workers or even nearby hospitals were infiltrated by the same cartel that tried to murder him and his partner. The cartel bullets that targeted Zapata and Avila were traced to guns trafficked into Mexico by Operation Fast and Furious. The operation was a failed and controversial U.S. Justice Department operation, which allowed thousands of weapons from our nation to fall into the hands of Mexican drug cartels. But if you talk to anyone who has worked in law enforcement on the border, there is one fact they all acknowledge. Drugs and humans come north, while money and weapons flow south. A retired DEA agent, who wishes to remain anonymous because of his continuing work in the region, is going by the name of Ralph. He's seen the war on drugs up close and personal.
With the cartels that operate along the border, they control the migrant flow, they control also the drug flow, what goes in the area. As for money being sent down to Mexico, they also control that part. Most of the money that is transported into Mexico is, it's transported in bulk cash and concealed compartments. Some of it is done also by wire remitter service using different types of wire service companies like Sigue or Western Union. Some of these companies have been have been fined by the U.S. government and have paid hefty fines.
Our federal agencies are limited by their own regulations and law. They are also limited financially by budgets. Cartels have unlimited resources, and they are not bound by any legal constraints. Think about this. You're working in uniform on the border. You're being watched. They're collecting your data. You're being wiretapped, and you can't fight back. Cartels are operating on both sides of the border, while U.S. Border Patrol agents are on just one side. They're unsure if they can trust their Mexican counterparts. Chris Olivares from the Texas Department of Public Safety says there's no doubt the cartels are getting more brazen and more violent.
These are violent individuals. They have no regard for human life. And we're talking about when they are publicizing their acts of violence by beheading people, dismembering people, setting people on fire, firing against, military and law enforcement on the Mexican side. These are violent criminals. These are violent individuals. So just to put that in perspective, think about the people that are coming across into Mexico that have to deal with these individuals who are going to allow them, if they will allow them, to cross into the U.S. because they got to pay to get across. It's not for free. They're profiting off the situation right now, and that's another issue right there is that we're allowing this to take place, so we are enriching these cartels even more.
They are well armed. Some of the weapons are flowing from America down to Mexico and then turned against our border agents and law enforcement.
We cannot lose focus on the threats on the southern border from the cartels because, we've shared plenty of photos and different events that have taken place along the border when it comes to drugs and weapons that are going south. We're talking about military-grade weapons, fully automatic weapons, 50 caliber rifles that are coming across, going into Mexico to supply the cartels. And it is a threat. It is a threat because they're within miles from the southern border. And you see how the power that they have and how enriched they are because they're able to corrupt not only in Mexico, but as well on the U.S. side. So they are very powerful, very brazen in what they do. And it is a serious threat that we should all be concerned about.
The cartels have hundreds of billions of dollars in illicit funding. And Victor Avila says they are willing to outspend even the American government over access to the porous U.S. border.
They don't have a budget. Their budget is limitless, and they have a lot more money that the United States has to combat them. And plus, they're headquartered in Mexico, but they're everywhere around the world in over 40 countries. Number one in the United States because the product, the drugs, the methamphetamine, the fentanyl is where it's coming here. We just had the brand new stat come out of over 100,000 deaths due to this poison that the cartels continue to come into our country. Now, you've heard back in the 80s where the big crack epidemic and the big stink that was done and all, it was all over the news, and that was 10,000 deaths. We're at 100,000. No one blinks an eye in Washington, D.C. But I always tell people when I do my speaking engagements, think of the cartels as Amazon. When you think of Amazon, what do you think? You think of a large corporation, billion-dollar corporation, organization, distribution. They're everywhere. That and organized. That's the cartels. They're highly sophisticated, well organized. They are everywhere in our country, not just in Mexico.
Our government's failure to have consistent border protections and regulations has allowed the cartels to develop complex systems to enter our country illegally and set up vast criminal enterprises that rival those of even some legal corporations.
Has it gotten easier under President Biden? ¿Se ha vuelto más fácil desde que llegó a la presidencia Biden?
En algunos momentos, sí.
At the moment, yes, because it is easier to gain access to the places we travel to.
Longtime DEA agent Derek Malt says this leaves our federal law enforcement overwhelmed, outspent, and outgunned as cartels and traffickers push as many people as possible across the border so that border officials are too overwhelmed to effectively interdict the trafficking of drugs, guns, and money.
They're flooding the zone. What does that mean? They take the rafts, they bring the people in, they bring them right to the Border Patrol. Here you go, Border Patrol. But then a mile down the border, they'll flood the country with these special interest aliens. They'll flood the country with drugs, and then they'll open up the way for the weapons and the cash to come southbound. So they're accomplishing all their goals in their business enterprise just by sending the migrants in. And let's not forget how much money they're charging the migrants to get here. And now we're seeing for the first time the tags. They're tagging the migrants like they're cattle to make sure that they're paying the pesos, the taxes, right? Because if they don't pay the fee to the cartels, then their family is vulnerable in these countries.
Republicans and Democrats have an incentive to look the other way on this border crisis. They ignore it. They want us to ignore it, and they refuse to confront it. Some are hoping to turn these migrants into cheap votes. Others love access to cheap labor. But in the end, every American is the victim of this dereliction of duty. And our enemies are taking advantage.
This is not a Republican and a Democratic issue. This is a red, white, and blue issue. All America will be impacted and has been impacted from this catastrophic crisis that we have with the cartels working with China. And it will continue because right now there's no action. There's a lot of talk. There's a lot of misleading going on, but there's no action to deal with the cartels.
In our next episode, we'll explore this connection between these ruthless cartels and America's greatest adversary on the international stage, Communist China. I'm Sara Carter. I hope you'll join me then.